Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session today. It's entitled Breaking Down AI, the Underlying Language and Technology of Artificial Intelligence in Legal. My name is Austin Hoppert, and I'm here today with Joseph Raczynski. Thank you so much for joining us. Now I'd like to introduce the presenter, Joseph Raczynski. He is an innovator and early adopter of all things computer related. His primary focus is around the future of technology, and he speaks around the world about legal tech, cybersecurity, blockchain, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, and drone technology. He also writes about the future of technology as it impacts the crossroads of our personal and professional lives, particularly in the legal sector. He co-hosts a podcast with a tech focus under the umbrella of Thomson Reuters and serves as a mentor with the Columbia IBM Blockchain Accelerator. He is a cybersecurity committee member at the University of South Florida and is a presidential committee appointee to the American Bar Association Center for Innovation Governing Council. Currently, Joe is with Thomson Reuters Legal, managing a team of technologists for both the large law, corporate, and government divisions in the US. Joseph serves the top law firms in the world consulting on legal trends and customizing Thomson Reuters legal technology solutions for enhanced workflows. If you like, you can connect with Joseph at joetechnologist.com or Joseph Raczynski or on Twitter at Joe Raz. And with that, I will hand it over to Joseph.
Austin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I'm absolutely looking forward to this conversation. And it is a conversation. So feel free to always reach out to me if you have any thoughts or questions about any of this stuff. But today, I'm really excited to get into breaking down AI, right? The underlying language and technology of artificial intelligence in legal. There's a lot going on in this space right now, which is fantastic to see. Scary sometimes, I know, but it's something that we need to dive into and see how it goes for all of us. So today's agenda, we're talking about the current state of technology. I always tend to just do a little snippet on the way that things are changing for all of us, both inside and outside of the legal space, right? So we're going to do a little bit of a dabble into that. So current state of technology, then I'll dive headlong into artificial intelligence, the technology, the practice of law, the business of law, how it all converges when we're talking about AI. We'll also talk about the differences between NLP and AI, so natural language processing. What is that? Why does it matter in legal? Well, it matters a lot, so let's get into that too. Who here, and if this was all in person, I would have loved to hear it. I would say, who loves sentence diagrams? I don't, but I know some of you must because you went into the legal space, which is really all about language for the most part at its essence. So we're going to talk about sentence diagramming of all things, because that is a big component about what we're talking about when we get into AI and the legal space. So we'll jump into that for a little while, and then we'll get into the differential components of linguistics. So the levels, how we analyze and how we model them, talking about words and phrases and sentences, discourse and conversation. So all of those pieces are an incredibly important component for the way that the legal industry looks at AI, how it digests it, and how it will utilize it going forward. So now let's open up the curtain on how we're talking about the state of technology today. So my mantra for the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 years when I talk with law firms and corporations and government agencies of all sizes is this emphasis around exponential growth. Now, in the past, I've gone through and beaten this like a dead horse in the idea of how important it is for all of us to wrap our minds around what exponential growth looks like, what it feels like. I'm not going to do that this go around. Suffice to say, each one of us are aware of how important technology is to everything that we do right now, especially in the legal industry. So I just want to point out a few examples that are tangents to the legal industry, but will relate to how fast things are moving going forward. The first one that I'd like to bring up right now is this picture. It's split in half. On the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to see these little chips, cubes, whatever they are. You're like, what the heck is that? On the right-hand side, you see a finger holding those chips to help identify with how small those chips are. Those are GPS-enabled chips. This is smart dust. Crazy to think about. Hitachi, I believe, built these things. It's smart dust. You could smear it on anything. You'd be able to track that device across wherever it is using the chips. Fantastic. Also kind of scary to be able to smear that stuff onto something and be able to track it. But that's the direction that we're starting to see things go in. One of my classic examples that I love to bring up, if you haven't seen this, it's worth just a moment of attention on. Was an MIT student getting his PhD, and what he had developed was this kind of goofy looking device that wraps around his ear, goes along his chin, up to his lips, has 4 sensors on it. And what it allows him to do is use what he's thinking in his internal voice to connect to the device and then use that to connect to other IoT devices, such that he's using his mind to change the channels because he has his TV all set up with an IoT device. Brainwave activity, not saying a word, not touching a thing, interprets it such that he can actually use that technology to connect to other devices. Now, you can extrapolate this out to any number of things. Maybe two partners wearing these things. They could just sit across from each other, never say a word, and they would know everything that the person is thinking at that moment in time. We're at mind reading technology. In the last several days, I saw that Facebook is doing the exact same thing. They've come up with a bracelet on their hands, and it's using the same connectivity from the mind to what you would normally type on your computer or your phone, so you don't have to type it. This is a direction of technology, and it's going to filter in through every industry, most especially legal. Last one, kind of out there and trippy in some respects. This is lab-grown brains. And they've basically taken stem cells and they've grown these little matter that you can see, gray matter, in these petri dishes, and they've been able to generate human brains that have the brainwave activity of a newborn baby. And then NASA decided, what can we do with this? Oh, well, let's put it into a robot spider and launch it into space. No idea why they're doing this, but this is a direction of what we're starting to see in the space. Now, as we talk about AI, and let's sort of level set and move in that direction, like where are we starting to see things really sort of take off? I'm not going to put the audio on this for right now, but what we hear here is actually previous President Obama. Sounds like him, looks like him, but it's a deep fake. And he's saying things right now that you're like, whoa, why would he ever say this sort of thing? This is the direction that we're going to start to see things moving, right? So taking over the idea of being able to a trusted source of information, maybe it's a video or a picture. Can you really trust that at this point? If you start to think about maybe you're presenting something in a trial, can you trust the video that you see? Has it been manipulated? These are the types of things that we're starting to see. One other quick example, so Al Pacino, and we're seeing an interview here, and he's able to adapt right away in his facial expressions and what he sounds like to sound like Al Pacino. And you're going to see a glimpse of it really quickly. Um, and I'd encourage you to go online and take a look at this. I'm going to stop it in just a second and go on to the next slide, but you'll see the facial expressions, everything change in just a moment. And that's a deep fake. And that's what we all have to start thinking about as a watch just now. See? And I'd love for you to hear the audio, but I figured it might be too much, so I hold off on that for now. But he sounds just like Al Pacino, and so these are the types of things that we're going to start to see in the legal industry as something we need to worry about or think about as we work as professionals in this space. Now, this next example is also something that lends an eye and an ear to the idea of what we need to think about with AI not being perfect. So it's not perfect yet, but we're moving in the direction for it to be a little more close to perfection. This is a bot on Twitter. That sole responsibility is to go out to the Wikipedia of images. So there's basically a Wikipedia of all the images in the world, the categorization of all these images. It looks at those images and it tries to figure out what is in that image. It's called, pick describe bot, basically. That's what it essentially is. And you can go on, you can follow them, and every day they send out another image and they say, oh, this is what we think it is. The computer thinks it is using AI. Here's some examples. So it identified this as a snow-covered bridge. Right on, it got it perfect. This one is a person standing in front of a building. Yes, not the best picture, but yes, this person is standing in front of a building, and sadly, it looks like there's a flood there. A plate of food with a fork. Spot on. Excellent, Mr. Bot or Mrs. Bot. Next one is a bag of luggage sitting next to a train station. We could see where this may have gone awry, right? They kind of look like the old school bags that you might have had, but they're turnstiles to go onto a whatever, a subway or a metro train station. Wrong. The next one is, and it's difficult to see this, it's one of those classical paintings from the Renaissance era, a vintage photo of a group of people posing for a camera. Clearly not. This is a one of those frightening pictures or paintings from yesteryear, many moons ago. A close-up of a slice of pizza. No, it got that wrong as well. This next one always gets me. A group of stuffed animals sitting on top of a building. No, it's more accurately described as probably a group of people in a rotunda. You get the idea, right? So AI is moving in a really solid direction, but it's not completely and totally there at this point in time. So let's go through really quickly the beginnings of AI. All right, this really has its roots in my opinion, in popular culture. When we start talking about the grandmaster chess player in the world, Garry Kasparov, who played Big Blue, so IBM, way back when. This is, I think, maybe the 90s-ish time frame, and people were like, "There's no way that the best chess player in the world could ever lose to IBM and their AI." And they played a number of matches, and of course, the long story short, Garry Kasparov lost, and he was just brilliant. It still is brilliant, but he lost, and that was an eye opener for most people in the industry across the board. Like, what in the world happened there? Waited a few years. Next big leap forward was, of course, Jeopardy. And at that point in time, you had Ken Jennings and Brad playing against IBM Watson. So IBM enhanced their algorithms and made things more advanced, and they used language interpretation. They used, and this is some background information I think is kind of interesting. IBM basically said, you know what, we'll take Wikipedia, pull it offline. So the biggest encyclopedia in the world, pull it offline. We'll do metadata about that. So data about that data, pull it offline, run our algorithms, put it in our own cloud, understand what Alex Trebek is asking or saying, and then from that, on the screen, hopefully you can see this, there's a list, what we call a stack ranking. And this is important when you think about AI. AI is not serving up a singular answer, but it's usually stack ranking. It's saying, all right, we think the probability of this answer is most likely. And so in this instance, you see albinism as 98% likely that that's the proper question or answer, right? And we know the outcome from this. IBM Watson throttled these two gentlemen in this instance. And it was another eye-opening instance of AI. These two first examples, there's one more example coming, are using brute force. So basically they're using AI and trying to figure out every single possible answer, every single possible move. This is where things changed. So several years ago at this point, we have the last example. And this is an example where Google decided to buy some of IBM's algorithms, enhance them, play around with them, and they decided to go down the road of the game Go, which is very popular in Asia. I've seen some people play it in cafes or shops, and basically it's very simple in its concept, and that is one person playing against the other person. The board is roughly a 21 by 21 board, and the object of the game is a white stone against the black stone, and you try to take as much of the board as you possibly can, the territory of the board as you possibly can. The difference with this, say, versus chess, is that when I put down my first stone, maybe my black stone, my opponent puts down their white stone, there's 150,000 possibilities afterwards. And AI, while in time, will be able to figure out every natural combination or permutation of that. It's really difficult to do that. Whereas in chess, I put my first move down, my opponent puts down their second move, there's 300 possibilities. So AI can figure that out really quickly. And so this is a major step forward and made people really wonder, wow, this is significantly different, such that some of the best minds in the world that spend all of their waking hours on AI, including Elon Musk, said, you know, what's going on in this space? Like, how can this work? What happened was you had one of the best players in the world play against Google in this instance, and they gave the AI 4 moves, head start. And they said, all right, let's see what happens. And the AI won. But the best minds looked at this and they said, all right, well, if you did 1-to-1 and there's no head start moves or anything along those lines, it's going to take another 10 years before we get to the point. So looking at almost even 2030 before AI could actually beat the human person at that point in time. And it took 2 years. So 2 years later, it actually was able to beat the human in that game, which is a major leap forward. Google has since taken those algorithms and applied it to their autonomous vehicles. They've applied it to their second biggest resource out there, intensive resources out there, which is electricity. And they have the best data scientists in the world, men and women who are trying to figure out the best ways to more efficiently tackle their energy crisis and what they're trying to do. They put this algorithm essentially in a black box, what they call a black box in a corner, let it run for a few weeks, and they turned it on. They said, okay, how can we better utilize electricity as a huge user of electricity? And immediately it dropped off 15% usage. And they said, there's no way. We have the best minds at work in this space. They turned off that algorithm and boom, went right back up to where it was before. Major leap forwards in deep learning, in neural networks. And we'll talk about neural networks and deep learning in a second because it's going to apply to the legal industry. So that's the history. That's the beginnings of all of this and why we're even talking about it in the legal industry. So now, the grand beginning of AI in the legal industry. And I've been in this industry for a long time now. And the way that it looked from Richard Suskind's view, the way that when I've talked with the CIOs, managing partners of various organizations, years ago, I would even say 6 years ago, there was, for the most part, denial. Yeah, there's no way that AI or any algorithm is going to be better than our people. We don't see a real use case for this. It doesn't make sense. And a lot of firms were in that mindset. There were some outliers, clearly. I mean, the general counsels were pushing back on this. Firms were like, yeah, maybe not, but we just really don't see it for now. Within the last 5 years, there's been a monumental shift in the way that we think about it, the way that organizations are looking at this. So general counsels are rethinking this. Firms are working differently, as I'm sure you're all very aware of. There's alternative sourcing. We're in this medium term of resourcing, of how we look at things differently, how we're thinking about it. Stage 3. This is disruption. This is where we will see various components of the practice of law or the business of law sort of get to the point where things change a little bit. In the short term, we're probably overestimating the accounts for how AI will disrupt the industry. But in the long term, we may be underestimating that. That's what Richard Suskind says, who's sort of the preeminent thought leader in this space. It's 10 years out. It's very difficult to determine what the outcome is going to be, but there's no question that AI will continue to foster and grow the way that we think about how we work in the industry, how we interact with data, how we provide information, results, returns, decisions, advice to our clients. So that's something we always have to be omnipresent about, I guess, in this space. So going forward, moving ahead with the complexity of legal analytics and artificial intelligence, clearly it started in the beginning on the bottom left-hand corner, working all the way up to the right, legal statistics and search. And we see this even with legal research now. I mean, the advanced research that happens is amazing. It really makes things faster and easier to cull through millions of documents, sometimes billions of documents very quickly. So predicting billing, extracting facts, all of that stuff, you'll get to the point where legal strategy planning will be something that will be certainly helped by AI at a bare minimum. So that's sort of the direction that we will move in. It may sound a little threatening in some respects, maybe for some people, but there's huge silver linings that we're going to get into. A lot of potential going forward. One of which is this. There is an immense amount of legal tech startups that have pounced into this industry, jumped into what I call affectionately ankle biters. They're basically going after different sections, maybe different practice areas, to try to enhance and make those practice areas more efficient, to help their clients, maybe access to justice. All of this starts to converge. And I would say even 5 years ago, there were probably 2 to 3 to 400 different legal tech startups. Now you're talking about 2 to 3,000. Basically, professionals, probably attorneys that say, you know what, I've been in this industry for the last 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, and I see a better way. We just haven't done it. Now we have this technology to help us do that. And this is how we go about doing it. And so then they tap some technologists, some developers, some coders, some user interface people to bring this together, to come up with that idea, to then bake it out and potentially sell to a large organization. That's the space that we're seeing just blossom and boom right now. So that's one of the directions that's we're going in. Now, back to the AI. AI is a huge bucket that we didn't even want to use. Honestly, artificial intelligence, did we even want to use that 5 years ago? A lot of the industry didn't because it sounded kind of futuristic, sci-fi. Is it really applicable? Because there's a lot of things that are underlying that are really the components of AI. What you see on your screen is just, it's a subset of the whole. And what we're talking about is things that we're all familiar with. So image recognition, machine vision, speech to text. When you're speaking into Siri or speaking into Google, whatever, asking a question, stuff that you're using all day long, right? And now that's creeping into the legal industry. More importantly, as practitioners in this space, the area that you would want to be most acutely aware of are these. So machine learning, ML, and natural language processing, which we're going to go into in depth about. But these are components of deep learning and supervised and unsupervised learning, classification of information. As we go through this, you're going to be like, got it. It makes sense. I hope. I hope it's part of my job here. But this is key to all of this because this is where it thrives in legal. This is what legal and practitioners are going to be involved with. If not on the front end, you as practitioners, but on the back end, what's leading up to the direction of you being able to do these types of things. Lots of things in this space in terms of organizations. I see them as several buckets, and this comes from Neotologic, but I like to cite, I love how they put this together. So expertise automation is one bucket of areas, right? Legal research is yet another huge area that people have spent time on. Analytics and prediction, that's yet another area that's huge. That's definitely growth area beyond the beyond. Contract analytics, yet another huge growth area. Electronic discovery, the old man or woman in the bunch, that is the original area that we started to see AI filter in through. So we'll talk about all this, but that's AI in legal in a nutshell. Now, let's break down AI, machine learning, and natural language processing. Tanya Custis is a data scientist, and I love what she's talked about in this space and how she's broken this down. So I'm borrowing some of her ideas here, but it's really well conceptualized. So AI is this huge bucket that we're talking about, right? That we really didn't want to use before, but now we are. So it's rules-based systems, logic-based reasoning, knowledge representation. If you ever want to conceptualize in my tiny little head what AI is, and someone says, all right, it's AI this, AI that, just think of it's an if-then statement. AI at its root is basically an if-then statement. It means that if this happens, then do this, or if this happens, then do that. That's all it is, right? It gets far, far more complex, more difficult. But you think about it as a tree with branches, it keeps going out in that different direction. So at its basis, just think about it as that. Now, subsets of AI include machine learning, which we're going to go into more in depth. Underneath machine learning is supervised machine learning. And yet underneath that is also unsupervised machine learning. We'll define each and every one of these. Hopefully they'll make sense. Something that crosses over both of those is deep learning, also called neural networks. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, let's talk about that big bucket first, machine learning. So natural language processing. As you see on your screen, and as I'll talk through this, you're like, yeah, get it, got it. Because to me, they're very obvious once you see the how it translates over. We'll do clockwise, starting with the beautiful teal colored one of machine translation. Simple as this. Someone, at some point in time, group of people, basically took things like letters or words and translated them into something. So I think about, let's say, Japanese, the language Japanese, and the characters that they have for that, they translated or mapped it over into the alphabet that we use in English right now, a one-to-one. This means that. That's machine translation. So that's part of machine learning, natural language processing. Another piece of this is information retrieval. Let's pretend that you're at a small law firm, maybe a solo shop. You've hung your own shingle and you have a website and it has all of 4 pages. It's perfect. It has who you are, your background, what you specialize in, maybe your blog. 4 pages. So your landing page and all those other pieces, right? At its root, what we're talking about is information retrieval. Maybe you have a little search box on that. And that search box has looked at every single word and categorized every single word on those 4 pages. It said, this is every single word. So that when Joe goes to your website and types in IP, intellectual property, it knows to go to page 4 because Maria has talked about that she's working in IP and she specializes in this area in DC, working at the PTO, whatever the case is, right? So it pulls up that information, and that's pure information retrieval. Sentiment analysis. You're looking at buckets of words that are either positive, negative, neutral, and it's looking for those words. So it might be, I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head that makes that's more positive. So whatever, you get the idea. Positive words or negative words are bucketed so that when someone types something in that's either positive or negative, it pulls up that information that might be positive or negative. Information extraction. It goes back to what I was talking about with metadata. So data about data. So think about your kitchen, right? So what's in your kitchen? Your refrigerator, your sink, your stove. All of those things are individual words, but what's some data about that? Well, those are pieces of your kitchen. So they could be a subset or the overarching word for that. Yeah, things you might find in your kitchen. So that's information extraction. So pulling those things out, making those connections of data to data, and then questioning and answering. Simple as this. It might be a human who has said that this sentence, who is Joe Raczynski, means this is a paragraph about Joe Raczynski. Who is DLA Piper? This is the firm. This is the information about them. So direct question and answering. And someone actually programmed that out initially. All right. A subset of what we were talking about before, machine learning, is supervised learning versus unsupervised learning. I'll spend 30 seconds on this because it should be, from my vision, I hope this makes sense in terms of how I describe this. It's fairly straightforward. Unsupervised machine learning is an algorithm, those if-then statements, an algorithm, AI, that basically you give the machine, the computer, a huge data set, billion documents. And you're basically saying, algorithm, look at this and just come back, like go through it for a week and come back with information that you think is salient. Like what salient points are in this? What space would I glean or learn from through almost a dashboard view of the most popular words or concepts? And it comes back to me and it says, this is what we came up with. And you're like, all right, cool, that's great. And so it does that on its own. It's using the algorithm, it's calling through the data, it's looking for themes or essence, and it's serving that up to you. That's unsupervised machine learning. Supervised machine learning is very similar in some respects. The machine is sitting over there in the corner, it's calling through all of this data, and it's serving up to you, this is what we came up with over the last week. And you're like, excellent, but not really what I want. And you said, I want you to focus in on this. And you point it towards data, concepts, clusters, and then it goes after that information, does it for another week, usually maybe sometimes seconds, comes back and says, what about this? That's supervised machine learning. So you're basically giving it guidance on what it's supposed to do. Machine learning, and we're talking about computer vision, this applies to ediscovery. Right? So the first area that we ever saw this. Now, what's going on in the background? Computer vision tasks. The first thing that we're trying to teach that algorithm is that on the left-hand side, let me get my cursor up here, that this is a cat. You're classifying the data. So it's going through 1 billion pictures of cats and it's saying, okay, this is the cat now, and we're localizing. So we now know generally the cat fills up this part of the picture. Then it's doing the next iteration of object detection. All right, here's a cat, here's a dog, here's a rubber ducky, and here's another cat, right? Or kitten. The next leap forward is instant segmentation. So it's seeing the cats, it's seeing the dogs and the rubber ducky, and it's seeing the exact space that they fill up. It literally takes 1 billion pictures of cats to train the computer to get to the point of it understanding this stuff. We can see this for the most part, and we'll get it, but sometimes the computer might need some additional training because you can get to the point where try to figure this one out, right? We may even have trouble distinguishing between the blueberry muffin and the chihuahua. It gets tough sometimes, right? So computers are not perfect, the algorithms are not perfect, and they're getting to the point of trying to digest this information, but they're getting far more sophisticated than they ever have, and they're getting exponentially more sophisticated in this space. So this is computer vision, and this is partly what ediscovery relies on to extrapolate out what information's in there. Now let's talk about data itself. I don't want you necessarily to read through all this, but the concept of this is that you have several data sets. You have this huge billion document data set, then you have that you train things on, and then you have a subset of information that you're sort of making sure that it's accurate against. So we're talking about validation information to make sure that you've gone through that. And if we talk about e-discovery, we're talking about maybe you pull down a subset of documents from that billion documents you have, 50 attorneys go through that, looking for information that makes sense, that's pertinent to the case, that's relevant for that case. And then you're saying, this is our document seed set. Let's train that as this is documents we know that the billion documents need to look at to compare against. Yes, so that's validation set. So test data, validation data, and training data are important when you're going through this process. All right, one of the last concepts in the machine learning that I want to just touch on, we will not go into depth with because you could spend weeks, if not months or years, spending in-depth conversation on this. But this is machine learning. So this is what that third example, historical example of the game Go used, and what we're going to see more and more in the legal industry. And that's neural networks, deep learning, and some people think of this as computers working as brains, human brains. So think about 10,000, 100,000, a million computers interconnected, working on different components of data, and then relying on each other, saying, this computer learned this versus this computer learned this. This computer saw this pattern, and then they try to work together to combine, to mesh this data, such that you get to the point where if you wanted to translate, it's a little weird on the left-hand side, the house is blue, you can then, the computer then can figure that out in an instant. That basically translates to, I know this isn't a direct translation for those of you who speak Spanish, but Casa Azul, a little truncated there, but you get the idea. That direct translation, that's trying to understand, extrapolate out. It's learning at the same time. It's pulling these layers together. The nodes, if you hear about a node is a grouping of computers, servers. So computer, nodes, and servers, they're all kind of working together. They're basically a computer, a grouping of computers that work interconnected in a way like that. So I cannot go without speaking to this any further. One of the things we hear about all the time is bias, bias in algorithms. And there is no question, people that originally created the algorithm, that AI, potentially there's bias in that. And that's something that the industry is looking at very carefully. There is new jobs that are focused specifically just on that. What can we do about that? How can we fix that? How can we make sure that there's as little bias, meaning no bias, as possible in this system? The example that I like to give is, let's say there's 1,000 of you watching this right now, and we're all together, and each one of you said, Joe, we love this bakery. It's down the street, and they have the most amazing chocolate cupcake with white frosting and the sprinkles on top. And for those of you in the Northeast, maybe Rhode Island, you might say Jimmy's, but it has these Jimmy's sprinkles on top, and it's the most amazing thing. And I've now gone there 3 times, and I don't see it. They don't have it. And so my bias is that there's nothing there. Like every time I go, there's nothing there. So there's bias in almost everything. The one positive thing about this overfitting, and that's the technical term, just in case you wanted to know, overfitting is that this is really kind of a cool thing that someone brought to my attention recently, and that is with humans, it's really difficult to get our bias out. We're all working on unconscious bias and all that right now. It's very difficult to change the human bias, but once you're able to identify that with a computer, it's far easier to root that out. So I think that's a kind of a cool and positive thing going forward in this space. All right, AI and language. This is where we really wanted to get to the crux of all of this fun stuff going forward. And this is where we really get into it when we start talking about what is natural language processing, how is it different than AI? Natural language processing is a subset, a sub-discipline of AI that we sort of talked about in those bigger buckets earlier. So it's using techniques like machine learning and deep learning to sort of learn with large amounts of linguistic components baked into this. So this is where we're about to get into subwords, words and phrases and clauses and sentences and multi-sentences and discourse levels. So if you have been in, or you maybe an undergrad, or whatever the case, were into linguistics or into English, literature, history, all of that fun stuff, this starts to definitely tie in. So we're going to talk about the functions that the data scientists look at when we're talking about AI. So stemming, entity tagging, phrase chunking, parts of speech tagging, syntactic parsing, semantic analysis, and discourse analysis. We'll touch on these, and I think they'll resonate as we go through this. As always, let's touch on a little bit of history here, starting with the 1950s. So stemming basically is looking at words and breaking it down just into understanding the word itself. So really, we're talking about removing inflectional, fixing pieces from this to normalize them. Really, what does that mean? Well, it means this. Humans, people, men and women, actually years ago mapped words so that work translated to work. Worked, past tense, translated to work. Works, plural, translate to work. Literally, humans did this. Kind of bizarre to think about AI at such a human level, but that's one of the themes that I should emphasize that I have not. A lot of the AI that we have today started with humans doing all of the work. So humans translated run to run, ran to run, to be, been, be, is. So the irregular verbs that we all know. And then nouns and confusing English words. And you can look at this from every language. Clearly, we're just looking at English right now, but someone had to make these transitions. And it gets complicated. The more and more you start to think about this, if we're looking at acts and acts versus acts, an axis. So the axis of something or the axis of evil, all of these types of things and phrases and how we look at those bits and bytes of information are all a part of this. So ultimately, these rules, in the beginning, they are rules. So remember I was talking about the if-then statements? That is what AI was originally baked out to be, and fundamentally is still a lot of behind the scenes. So rules are good, but they're difficult. So what we need to do is start to get more advanced. 1950s all the way through, I'd say even to the 80s, and behind the scenes is still happening today. So let's jump into parts of speech tagging. And this is where, for those of you who like to sentence diagram, I definitely remember the days when I had to do this, and I actually was not a fan of this, but now I actually appreciate it a little bit more. So this is what our linguists, even at the company that I work for right now, Thomson Reuters, and Google, all of these huge organizations that spend a lot of their time on AI have, I think Google had, I dare say, someone mentioned 2,000 linguists who were brought in to do this sort of thing. So let's break this down. Sorry, a little tangent there. Paul is a noun. Yes. Brought is a verb. The is a determiner in this instance. Food is a noun. To is a preposition. Another determiner with the, and then table in this instance is a noun, right? Paul brought the food to the table. Boom. Easy, straightforward. We all can get this. So with this sentence, the probability states that Paul is a noun. Yeah, we get that. But it does get more complicated. Now think about this sentence. The committee decided to table the motion. Now we need to reprogram and rehelp the AI to think about this differently. Let's break this down. So the determinator, the is the determiner. Committee is a noun. Decided is a verb. To is a preposition. Table is a noun. Determiner, of course, is the, and then motion. Now, if we think about that, maybe something is potentially off, right? So to table is different. So let's switch that, right? So instead, we're talking about an infinitive and a verb, because as you all attorneys know this, we're talking about basically to table being clearly some more legalese almost. It's a verb in this instance. So that's what you need to train and think about, training the computers to think about in this space. Next step, phrases and name entity tagging. So again, we're talking about humans more than likely going back and saying, here's a paragraph that we pulled from, I don't know, Reuters or something like that. Ex-Obama administration official is going to testify in some Trump-Russian probe. Not getting political here, just looking at the data that's in here. What someone had to do was say, okay, Barack Obama, well, that's a proper name. Donald Trump, that's a proper name. US, let's translate that into United States. James Clapper, another proper name. Sally Yates, same sort of thing. Then we look at concepts or groupings of words that we should think about. Democratic administration, US intelligence agencies, congressional committees, Vladimir Putin. These pieces have to be identified, have to be tagged. So someone literally had to tag these things at some point in time. But once it's been tagged, you're kind of good to go. Something to be aware of behind the scenes. So grouping phrases and entities, noun phrases, verb phrases, and concepts is a core component to all of this. Now you get to a little more complicated. As we go through this, it gets a little more complicated. So syntax, structure at the sentence level. So syntactical structure giving us insight into semantic relationships. Semantic relationships. So we're getting more involved. So dog, we'll go with the green letter words there. Dog bites man. So you see at the top level, sentence, but you also see the noun phrase and the verb phrase, bites man. Now, you can also switch that up. So man bites dog. So you have to try to figure out what is really the intent of that sentence. What is the meaning behind that? What is the context of it? All of this goes to the heart of what you all do typically, be it on the contract side or, of course, on the litigation side. So these bags of words have to be sort of processed and understood. The syntax of it have to be connected. The relationships have to be pulled together. Again, we have to teach the computer to do this. And it's a boatload of work on the back end to get it to the point where it understands these types of things. This hopefully is where it hits home, because it did for me. So on the syntax, let's say part 2, another sentence. How does a computer know? Let's read through the sentence. The woman saw the spy with the telescope. Think about that for just a second. The woman saw the spy with the telescope. What does that look like in your head? Like picture it. I ask you just to I beg you to picture that for a second. Two different ways of looking at this. The woman saw the spy with the telescope, or the woman saw the spy with the telescope. So let me break out this. So the woman, it's almost like a woman was looking through the telescope and saw the spy, or the woman was just looking out the window and saw the spy with the telescope. Nuanced things that we understand, but you have to teach the computer that. And so you get to the point of breaking down that language, understanding the nouns, the phrases. And so you get to the point of like, what is it that is really the intent here? And maybe sometimes the grammar components have a say in this, but if you're working off an email, an ediscovery, what was the intent? What was the purpose behind that? And now you have to have the computer try to decipher that. Another example of this that I like to bring up is John read the book on the table. We're like, yeah, okay, I totally understand that. John basically read the book. He probably pulled it off the table and read that book. Or John jumped up on the table and was reading the book. Or John was on you know what I mean? So you gotta try to understand that. And more importantly, the computer needs to understand that. So this is, I love this one. Sequence tagging, so parts of speech in terms of this. So the old man, the boat, right? The old man, the boat. It doesn't even make sense. The old man, the boat. Old man in the boat. So if we were to think about this differently, and change this out. And now you have it in this sense, the old, maybe a comma would help here, man the boat. It's different than the old man the boat. The old man the boat. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense necessarily, but you have to be able to teach the computer these types of things in order for it to truly understand what you are looking for, what your client is trying to get out of this sort of thing. So generally, to recap, these parts of speech and these phrases and all this stuff, what is needed? Well, you need to label the data. You need to be able to break down the problematic for specialized vocabularies, understand that sort of thing. You need to understand the complex syntactical structures and constructs that we have in the English language. Bake that out, understand it, and make sense of it. So legal syntax is different than general English, of course. Now, maybe some of you, maybe many of you, have to deal with head notes. Those head notes are the summaries that we may see before the huge amount of maybe the case and the idea behind what's going on within that particular piece of information. It's the summary. And we usually have humans who write these things, and they can be arduous to understand because they're elongated. Sometimes the sentences are a bit of a run-on, maybe, but in action, recover amount of settlement of action brought against plaintiffs as individuals for breach of lease on ground that defended, blah, 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 right? How can AI understand that language? How can it break it down? How could it summarize that particular document, that summary, whatever the case it is? That's what this language needs to try to understand. That's what AI is trying to break down at this point in time. And then if you think about it, one of the big issues that AI has is that if someone trained that machine and they missed one component of that, maybe it was the way that the language meant this verb or that idea or that concept or that clustering, then it propagates. So they trained it a certain way and they trained it on, let's say, a subset of documents. It can propagate, that error can propagate through the billion or trillion documents that it's looking at. So again, a lot of this stuff has to be carefully digested and understood. So one other area as we get more advanced is word vectors. Those something that the data scientists use to estimate semantic distance between words, to help concept clustering, to help with words in a corpus, to get an idea of their meaning in the words and where they may come up most specifically. So in this concept, the dog barked in the park. The owner of the dog put him on the leash since he barked. It's looking at the relationship of the word, so maybe the verb, to the noun, to how many times that word shows up or how many times the verb shows up. And it directly correlates the words to the verbs and the number of times that it shows up. And so they call this word vectors. And behind the scenes, they're joining these things, creating these sort of dynamics to make it so that the words on the page, the words through the billion documents make more sense. Fundamentally, these pieces of vectors that we're talking about become more and more complex and more involved to the point that we really need to start to figure out what's going on in this space. And we get to disambiguation from the context. So that bank clearly has more than what we would normally think about. When you hear the word bank, you're probably thinking about a bank, a financial institution. But there's the grass, there's the river, there's a steep bank, there's a muddy bank. Those are related. Those are concepts that are connected to that, because clearly we know that money, finance, withdrawal, deposit is yet a classic component of that. The data scientists use this. You probably will not need to, but an idea behind this is these 3D word enabled embedding concepts. The clustering that I talked about before, where we were talking about the kitchen and we're saying, oh, there's a refrigerator in the kitchen, there's a sink in the kitchen, there's a stove in the kitchen. It knows that those are separate words, but it's able to bring those together, saying that those are concepts that might revolve around a kitchen. You might be able to throw in brands for that as well. Again, word embeddings for all of this as it starts to come together. So the last one, and this is the most difficult, and this is what AI is really pushing forward in some of these spaces, is discourse. So most difficult, discourse refers to understanding the context of a larger group of sentences, how they relate together, right? how all these pieces of concepts are very complicated documents. It might be a very in-depth contract, referencing page 1, paragraph 3 to page 1021, paragraph 8. Which concepts overlay, or which are incongruous, that don't make sense. They're conflicting among those concepts, those ideas. And there's tools now that allow us to be able to see that, to run through all those documents, to help billions of men and women hours to look at that. So now you don't necessarily have to do that as much, which is kind of a good thing for, I think, most. But that's the level that we're talking about. So often these markets of languages are talking about, looking at therefore, meanwhile, those transitional words, and then comparing that from page 8 to page 10,000 on that document. Big time importance in this space, understanding what the intent of the original speaker, author, is making, and then trying to understand what makes the most sense and pulling out information from that. So that's kind of a big deal. All right, the concept with this one, which is neat, and if you haven't seen this already, is this: because data is so imperative these days, we're able to do a ton of things with it. So in the legal space, you're actually able to determine, based on what a judge has said, he or she has decided on something, their rulings, based on the dockets, you can see maybe that she's decided in this particular type of case, an IP, that she uses this phrase quite frequently when talking about this type of case. Well, you can go and say, all right, well, this judge has decided in favor of X, Y, and Z because they've used this language in this type of ruling. Our case is actually quite similar to this. So we know that 75% of the chance that we could win this case because we are in a similar boat. And it looks at the entity tagging. So the judges, the courts, the attorneys, law firms, and it's able to look at all this information, pull out, and give you analytics on this. This is a huge theme within the industry right now, to be able to leverage all this massive amounts of data to do things. So now we're talking about data scientists applying these algorithms to this huge amounts of data to then develop this sort of workflow of question analysis, query. So you submit a question, it's doing federated searches across vast amounts of information, giving you answers back, such to the point that you're at augmented intelligence. It's not telling you what to do, but it's giving you some pretty darn solid recommendations such that you can then make a better decision based on all of that. So these are concepts. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. One, because we don't have that much time left, but just to be aware of. We're talking about different models that we've really talked about. So bag of words, we're talking about capturing syntax and phrases, then sequencing tagging. We're talking about deterministic parsing. So takes a lot of time to do these types of things. And of course, deep learning and multitask learning, things that happen at the same time. So you're able to leverage a lot of that together. This slide, three quick points. A lot of words, but the 3 points is that in this industry, from my estimation, you need 3 things. And a lot of people are saying this, so it's not just me. You need the AI expertise, people that understand how AI works. You need the domain expertise, lawyers, attorneys that know their space cold. And then you need the data. When you're able to combine all of these 3 things together, you are at an amazing point in time where you're able to leverage the tools, the information, and the resources to serve up really cool things inside law firms, inside government agencies, or corporations, to do things that we have not been able to do ever before. So that's that 3-legged stool: domain expertise, the data, the AI expertise, and quite simply, if you don't have all of these 3 tied together, kind of silly, but yeah, the 3-legged stool falls because you're not going to be able to leverage everything together at the same time. So I'm knowing that we don't have a ton of time left. I'm going to be very quick about this, and I think this will resonate with most all of you. But artificial intelligence, the practice of opportunities and risks ahead. Well, contract review. And this applies to anybody who's practicing in this particular space. In-house legal departments can spend 50% of their time reviewing a document just to determine whether or not that document can be signed within the hour or less. Yes, now we have tools that can do that. There's an opportunity there. There's a risk there. JP Morgan has taken advantage of this clearly, but we're talking about a point where those firms, those organizations that implement, that use these tools will be ahead of the game because they can bring on new business, implement these tools, make it more efficient for them. It's a kind of a win-win for them, but there's also risks for those organizations to say, yeah, you know, I don't know if I want to do this. It's not ready. We're not ready for that sort of thing. I respect that, but it will be a challenge going forward if that continues to be, I guess, maybe the same mentality, possibly. We'll see. Contract due diligence, yes. Again, something fairly obvious at this point, but I'm just highlighting it. Lawyers ensure that contracts are not hiding obligations. I love to think about maybe those organizations that have a huge M&A deal, and there's two organizations, both have 10,000 employees each, and like, does this make sense for both of these organizations to work together? Let's look at their employment contracts. In the past, you'd hire 100 attorneys to look at this stuff, and they have to comb through every one of their employment agreements, combing through, looking for the golden parachute documents, which might be 10 of those 10,000 agreements. Like, oh, if there is a merger, then this individual, she gets $1 billion. Yeah, and you're looking for that and making sure you can mitigate some of that. That's now much easier to be able to determine and see through that. I quoted him earlier, Richard Susskind. If properly primed, those systems that we have right now, so those research tools, Westlaw, whatever, can actually do the amount of work that an old school junior attorney, lawyer could do, because it's calling through millions, if not potentially billions of documents based on natural searches that you would want to make, and it's pulling that up for you, hopefully much easier than it ever had before. Kind of a cool thing. So it's looking at other languages as well. And of course, there's opportunity and risks there too. Less need for that sort of whatever, that type of work, which is cool because it gives people opportunity to do other things in that space. Maybe one of the last ones, ediscovery. Old school, but yes, you can make huge increases in efficiency when you have machines looking for phrases, concepts, pictures that might be relevant or not in that space. Prediction, sorry, I may have one other one in there. Analyzes past, legal references, data, provides insights to future. We talk about the judge's decisions. I've spoken to many judges about this. They do not like this idea typically. I spoke before, I guess 200 appellate judges not long ago, and I saw them collectively tilt their head to the side and like, but because of language, because of these tools, that's the direction that we're going in, for better or whatever. Analytics, yes, a huge area going forward. No question, lots of opportunity, lots of risk. We've talked about this already. Fundamentally, there is a lot of potential here for those that decide to embrace this. I understand maybe some consternation in this space. My belief is that if you lean into this conversation and in this direction, there's going to be a lot of opportunity, a lot of potential going forward here. Feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. I love talking about this sort of thing, talk about this and cybersecurity and blockchain and cryptocurrencies and security. Here to talk about it, that's my role. That's what I do. I have a team of individuals, of technologists that do the same sort of thing. We are here for you. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Austin, thank you for being with us. And I believe we should be set. Thank you again. Take care and enjoy.